Is he seriously suggesting that the NHS should not engage in negotiations to ensure that British patients get the drugs they deserve? Is he so phobic? Is he so phobic of American companies that he would forbid them for having those discussions?
Mr. Speaker, not for the first time the Prime Minister is talking nonsense. Why did the Prime Minister previously say the health service wasn't on the table in any post-Brexit trade deal?
Mr. Speaker, the answer to that is very simple. It's because it is not on the table. And I pay tribute. By the way, I pay tribute to the officials of the NHS who have just done a brilliant job in reducing the cost of Orkambi so that cystic fibrosis, made in America, by the way, so that cystic fibrosis sufferers in this country get the treatment they need at a cost that is reasonable to the taxpayers of this country. And if he wants to know how the people of this country are able to afford the stupendous investments that we're now making in the NHS, £34 billion, the biggest ever investment in the NHS, 40 new hospitals that we are building as a result of the decisions that we are taking. It is because this is the party that supports wealth creation. And the reason we're able to invest in the NHS, Mr. Speaker, is that for the last 9 years, this economy has been growing. It has grown by 19% since the Conservatives first came into office. And he would ruin this economy and ruin our ability to fund the NHS. And that is the reality.
Mr. Speaker, we all welcome the fact that Orkambi will now be able to be provided in this country under the NHS, and we thank those that campaigned for it. The shame is that we're not told what the deal is with the company concerned. And as for these fabled 40 hospitals, that figure dropped to 20 and then finally dropped to 6. Mr. Speaker, we learned this week that government officials have met US pharmaceutical companies 5 times as part of the Prime Minister's planned trade detail. The US has called for full market access to our NHS, which would mean prices of some of our most important medicines increasing by up to 7-fold. Mr. Speaker, whilst the government is having secret meetings with US corporations, it's patients here that continue to suffer. Can the Prime Minister explain why the number of people waiting longer for urgent cancer treatment has tripled over the last 9 years?
Mr. Speaker, as he knows very well, this government is investing £34 billion into the NHS. We are seeing improvements in cancer survival rates across the country. We are seeing improvements in cancer survival rates thanks to the investments that this government is making. And I think it absolutely satirical, Mr. Speaker, that he should claim credit for getting Orkambi and other drugs delivered at a reasonable price. That is the work of the UK government. That is the work of the NHS supporting NICE to ensure that people in this country get affordable treatments. And he may not be aware of it, Mr. Speaker, but the Vertex, the company that makes Orkambi, comes from America. Is he seriously suggesting that the NHS should not engage in negotiations to ensure that British patients get the drugs they deserve? Is he so phobic? Is he so phobic of American companies that he would forbid them for having those discussions?
Mr. Speaker, not for the first time the Prime Minister is talking nonsense. Of course we need to import medicines from various places. I just want it to be done in an open and transparent way. I don't want secret talks between government officials on behalf of ministers with big pharma corporations in the USA. And last year, Mr. Speaker, 34,000 cancer patients waited more than 2 months for treatment. And whilst early detection is obviously very important, the longer people wait, the less chance there is of survival from cancer. The Prime Minister knows that, I know that, the whole world knows that. Why can't he get it and put the necessary resources into the NHS to cut the waiting times?
Right.
If he could just be patient for 30 seconds. He says, Mr. Speaker, he claims, Mr. Speaker, the NHS is safe in his hands. Why then has NHS privatisation doubled under this government, with nearly £10 billion being spent on private companies within our NHS?
Mr. Speaker, the NHS is receiving unrivalled and unprecedented sums of taxpayers' money. But if he is seriously saying that he would not like dentists and opticians and Macmillan care nurses to work with the NHS, then I think he frankly must be out of his mind, Mr. Speaker. Let me tell him that cancer survival rates have actually increased year on year since 2010. Cancer survival rates have increased, and more and more people are seen within the right waiting time, thanks to the investments that we are making. And I think he should pay tribute to the hard work of NHS staff, and he should recognise and stop talking down their incredible achievements. And he should recognise that we intend, if we come back as the next government, we will invest massively in that NHS and take it forward with the funds that we will make available from a strong and growing economy. And the reality is that he would wreck that economy.
Mr. Speaker, what we don't want is private companies like Virgin Healthcare suing our NHS for contracts they didn't get. Our NHS should be focused on making people better, not the wealthy few richer. The National Health Service A&E departments, Mr. Speaker, have just had their worst September on record. This morning, the Royal College of Emergency Medicine says this winter the NHS needs over 4,000 extra beds. Could the Prime Minister explain why, under his government, the number of people in England waiting for an operation has now reached a record high of 4.4 million?
Mr. Speaker, there's a reason why more people are receiving NHS care, and that is because the NHS is working harder and achieving more than ever before. And if he wants to look at what Labour, if the House wants to look at what Labour would be like in office, look at their performance in. Well, by the way, I should say the SNP government that negotiated a much higher price for Orkambi, it occurs to me, in Scotland. They did. They got the price totally wrong. He should have a word with them. If the people of this country want a horrific foretaste of what life would be like under a Labour-run NHS, look at the NHS in Wales, where all health targets are routinely missed. The A&E waiting target hasn't been met since 2008. Inpatient outpatients haven't been met since August 2010. Urgent cancer treatment. He talks about cancer treatment, Mr. Speaker. It hasn't been met since June 2008. That is how Labour runs the NHS, Mr. Speaker.
I'm surprised he can keep a straight face saying that while his government has cut so much from the Welsh Government's budget. And from a government that's cut 15,000 beds out of the NHS, that has cut $7 billion from social care, I don't know how he's got the brass neck to say what he just said. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, his words are hollow. Anyone who's tried to get a GP appointment, who sees how overworked our NHS staff are when they visit a hospital, and the stress NHS staff go through when they can't deal with all the patients that are coming in, he needs to think about this. I'll give an example. A lady called Gillian wrote to me this week. Yes, it's a real case of a real person. And I will quote her letter, if I may, Mr. Speaker. Gillian says, "My mother died in February as a direct result of the GP shortage in the UK. Her last years were marred by long waits for treatments and for interventions. Whenever she got care, it was given by overstretched but very dedicated people, but it always came after painful and debilitating delays." Why should that happen to Gillian's mum or anybody else's mum? The problem is the shortage of GPs, the shortage of nurses and the excessive waiting time for people with very difficult conditions and deep pain. They should be sympathised with and supported.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can certainly say that we will deal with his constituent Gillian's concerns, but I can tell him that there are 17,300 more doctors and over 17,000 more nurses on our wards since 2010, and I think, frankly, Mr. Speaker, it is time to differentiate between the politics of protest and the politics of leadership. And he should apologise, Mr. Speaker, for continually striking attitudes that I do not think are in the interest of the... It's all very easy to be an Islingtonian protester and say that you side with Russia over what happened in Salisbury, or to say that you have a £196 billion programme of renationalisation, or continually to flip-flop one way or the other, now leave, now remain, refusing to respect the verdict of the people in the referendum on the EU. Leadership means standing up for the people of this country, standing up for our police, standing up for our NHS, making sure that it gets the funding that it needs, and standing up for our economy and for our wealth creators. And above all, it means getting Brexit done and ending the dither and the delay. The time for protest is over, Mr. Speaker. It's time for leadership, and that is what this government provides.
Mr. Speaker, coming from a Prime Minister who withdrew his own bill, it seems a bit odd. My question, Mr. Speaker, was about somebody whose mother had died, and she believes that's because of the shortage of staff within the NHS. I would have hoped the Prime Minister would have tried to show some empathy and answer that question. Because GP numbers are falling, there's 43,000 nurses shortage in the NHS, and it suffered the longest spending squeeze ever in its history. Mr. Speaker, the choice at this election couldn't be clearer. People have a chance to vote for real change after years of Conservative and Lib Dem cuts, privatisation and tax handouts for the richest. This government that's put our NHS into crisis. This election is a once-in-a-generation chance to end privatisation in our NHS, give it the funding it needs, and give it the doctors, the nurses, the GPs and all the other staff that it needs. Despite the Prime Minister's denials, our NHS is up for grabs by US corporations in a Trump-style trade deal. Isn't the truth, Mr. Speaker, that
the right honourable gentleman will not be shouted down under any circumstances. He will complete his inquiry to the satisfaction of the chair, and people who think otherwise will quickly learn that they are, as usual, wrong. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite his denials, the NHS is up for grabs by US corporations in a Trump trade deal. Isn't the truth, and the government may not like it, isn't the truth that this government is preparing to sell out our NHS? Our health service is in more danger than at any other time in its glorious history because of his government, his attitudes and the trade deals he wants to strike.
Mr. Speaker, I do indeed agree that there is a stark choice facing this country at this election, and it is between economic catastrophe under the Labour Party, a £196 billion programme, taking away money from companies and putting it on a pointless renationalisation programme, putting up taxes on corporations, on people, on pensions, on businesses, and at the highest level in the whole of Europe, Mr. Speaker. That is the catastrophe, the economic catastrophe that he offers. But it's worse than that, because he also offers a political disaster, consigning next year, which should be a wonderful year for our country, to 2 more referendums, Mr. Speaker. Another referendum on the EU, because he can't make up his mind on what he thinks, flip-flopping this way and that, and another referendum on Scottish independence. Why on earth should the people of this country spend the next year, which should be a glorious year, going through the toxic, tedious torpor of 2 more referendums, thanks to the Labour Party? We want next year to be a great year for our country, Mr. Speaker. We want it to be a great year because we are going to invest more in front-line NHS services. We are going to reduce violent crime with more police officers on our streets, 20,000. That's what I pledged on the steps of Downing Street, and we've done it. We are going to invest in every one of our schools, primary and secondary, across the country. That's what I pledged on the steps of Downing Street, and we are delivering it. We are going to invest in a fantastic infrastructure programme for our country. Gigabit broadband across the whole nation. That's what I pledged on the steps of Downing Street. That is what we are going to deliver. And we are going to deliver a fantastic deal by which this country will come out of the European Union. A deal that he has tried to block and that we will deliver. That is the future for this country. Drift and dither under the Labour Party, or taking Britain forward to a brighter future under the Conservatives. That is the choice this country faces.